Tian Yuanzhuang, he's like Chen Kaige in a sense. I mean, of all those fifth generation students in the directing class at the Beijing Film Academy, he is kind of communist royalty in a sense, because both of his parents were very famous actors in communist movies of the 1950s. So his mother was Yu Lan and his father was Tian Fan. But both of them very well known and very much respected. So just as Chen Kaige is the son of a respected film director, when they arrived in the Film Academy, I think Zhuang was born in 1952, as I recall, and makes him very slightly younger than Chen Kaige. He'd been, in a sense, privileged much of his life. Chen Kaige had a very natural sense of authority. He cast himself as the leader of that group and behaved like the leader of that group. And he had a certain advantage because he was by far the most fluent English speaker in that group, which definitely gave him a step up above the others. And Zhuang doesn't speak any foreign language, including Japanese, although he has made a couple of films with Japanese actors. He's a quieter type, a much less assertive type, I think, than Chen Kaige, and much less inclined or likely to play on the privileges that he brought from his background. So when the Film Academy reopened, in, I think 1978, if I remember rightly, and at that time there were no premises for it. It was asked to share the space of an agricultural college in a village called Zhuxinzhuang, which was quite a far way north of Beijing, out into the countryside. It was a very rural area, as you would expect from an agricultural college. I went there once, and it was quite a long drive to get there out of the city. And when you got there, it was pretty basic. There were no facilities really to speak of. There were just empty classrooms. And nearly all the work in this school was theoretical, because there was very little equipment and there were very few resources to make films. So very few student films were made. One of the things I asked for later in the 1980s was, can I see, the exercises that people like Chen Kaige and Zhang Yimou made when they were in the school? Oh, there weren't any, is the answer. And it's true that Chen Kaige had no chance to make even a student exercise film during his time at the Film Academy then, because there was no resources for him to do it. So very few films were made as student works, student exercises. But Tian Zhuang did make one, together with two classmates. He co-directed a film on video. Video was then a fairly primitive technology, but it was obviously more available and cheaper than film stock. And they made a 45-minute film called Woman the Tiaoluo, Our Corner, based on a recently published short story, I think. A guy who had been disabled during the Cultural Revolution. He had, I can't remember how he lost movement of his legs, but anyway, he'd been confined to a wheelchair, and he wrote a story based on his own experience about sharing a space with two able-bodied men and trying to make a go of the difficult life after the Cultural Revolution. So this was a story that made a lot of sense, I think, to the Film Academy graduates, or Film Academy students at that time. And they chose this, and they adapted it for film. And Tian Zhuang and two others co-directed this with I think students from the acting department as the cast in the film. And it's rather good. It's one of the very, very few practical exercises in filmmaking that any of the students of that generation were able to make while they were in the school. Tian Zhuang was actually the very first of the graduates in '82 who did get to co-direct a feature film. And that's largely thanks to his mother, I think, to Yu Lan. Because Yu Lan, by that time, was not really acting anymore, but she'd been made head of the children's film studio. China had a children's film studio then, producing, specifically making educational films for kids. And she put together a project and suggested that her son and a couple of his classmates, plus other people like Zhang Yimou, who was, I think, brought on board as the assistant cameraman of the film, made a film called Hongqiang, Red Elephant, for children. It's not a terribly ambitious film. You'd have to say, if you look at this film now, you won't see very much sign of the Tianzhuangzhuang to come in this movie. However, it gave him useful experience, and he was able to follow it. I think he was assigned, if I remember correctly, to Beijing Film Studio, since he was a Beijing kid and his parents were both in Beijing. But Beijing Film Studio had nothing for him to do. Beijing Film Studio had, although it was one of the biggest studios in the country, it also had a very large number of directors resident in the studio looking for work, and there were many of them were very senior. They had much better claims to the year's limited resources than a young, fresh graduate like Tian Zhuangzhuang. So there was really nothing much for Tian Zhuangzhuang to do in the studio. I think he was offered some kind of assistant directing work and said, no, it's not very interesting, I don't want to do that. So he ended up making films elsewhere. And the first film he made was a film called September, Jiu, which he made for a tiny studio in Kunming, very far away. It's a very, well, if you see this film, you discover very quickly it's not a very impressive piece of work. It's a very cliched script, and it's treated, I mean, Tian Zhuangzhuang does nothing in the way he directs this film to transcend the limitations of the material. It's a very, very standard melodrama, everyday life melodrama of the time. But he took it because it was experience. It was a very useful experience for him. It was a job, it was a credit, it was a chance to actually direct something by himself. So he did that. And then he fished around for other things to do, and he managed to persuade the Inner Mongolia Film Studio, another very small outfit, another very remote outfit, far away from Beijing, far away from the mainstream of Chinese cinema, to allow him to direct a feature. And I think we noted when we were talking about Red Sorghum that these small regional film studios were very important for the fifth generation directors, because unlike the big studios in the big cities, where you had a pecking order, where you had senior directors who had first claim on the resources of the studio, and they would be the ones who would get projects, and younger people just brought into the studio would expect to wait many years before they got the chance to direct something. The small studios, it was not like that. The small studios, you could walk in and make a film, basically, if they needed you, because they were not established directors stuck there with first claim to the resources. In fact, the studios had been told by the government, you must make a certain number of films every year. Here's your budget, here's your quota, make these films, make this number of films. And they found themselves ill-equipped to do it. They didn't have local talent. They didn't have a roster of directors queuing up to make films. So if somebody from outside came along, as Tian Zhuangzhuang did in Inner Mongolia, they would be excited to have somebody trained in Beijing coming in to make a film and saying he would deal with Inner Mongolian life in certain ways. So in Inner Mongolia, Tian Zhuangzhuang made his second solo feature, which is a film called On the Hunting Ground in English, Liajiang Jiasa in Chinese. Baffling title in Chinese because Jiasa, which is a term not familiar to many people in the audience in China, is the name for a certain code of beliefs, a certain code that governs the hunters of the Mongolian plains. And the film is precisely about respecting the Jiasa traditions and breaking the Jiasa traditions and being punished for not observing these codes. This would be very mysterious, I think, even to Chinese audiences, because nobody knows anything really about Jiasa and those particular Mongolian traditions. Zhuangzhuang himself, I think, probably didn't know much either before he went there and started researching it. But for him, it was very, very interesting to make a film about a character who was trying to follow a certain code of behavior, failing to, and paying a certain price for it. Why would a subject like that be interesting to him? I think it's because of his Cultural Revolution experience. I think it's because of what happened to him in Jilin. When he was a young, wild Red Guard and was sent off to Jilin in 1968, I guess it would have been, he went to Jilin as a fervent young Maoist, I think. He was a Red Guard, like many of them. What happened to him in Jilin was that, he became politically disillusioned, I think. He found that the realities in remote parts of China were very different from what he'd been led to expect. And the behavior of local people was different from what he'd been led to expect. And his political certainties became political uncertainties in certain ways. And for him, that was a crucial experience, I think. It was the same thing happened to many, many of the other Zheqing. It happened to Chen Kai-ge in Yunnan. It happened to many people in many parts of China, actually. But when these urban kids found themselves sent off to remote parts of the country, they found that the experiences they had changed much of their thinking about China, about politics, about everything, actually, about their lives, their purposes in life, and all that, everything. So my sense is that when I see Liechang Jiasa on the hunting ground, I think it's about believing things and then not believing them, or breaking the codes that you've been taught to live by. And for him, I think this has a metaphorical meaning, which is something to do with his own experience in the Cultural Revolution. So Zhuang, it's not until later, it's not until the 1990s that Tian Zhuang tries to make directly autobiographical films. He makes a film called The Blue Kite, which is a very problematic film in China. He was told not to finish it, and somehow he did finish it, and it did get shown, and people were not very happy about that. And I'm still not sure the film has been released even now in China after all these years. But it was an autobiographical film. It was a film rooted in his own family experience and his own memories. And he wanted to follow it with a second one about his years as a Red Guard. From about his years in Jilin, in fact. And so he wrote a script called The Year My Finger Broke, which was based on that experience. Because of all the trouble about Blue Kite, he gave up. So he abandoned the project and has in fact never made it. But it was written and it was ready to be made, in fact, if he'd been able to do so. Anyway, in these films of the 1980s, I think his approach to his own experience was a bit more metaphorical. I don't think he was making films that were not based directly on his own experience. That came later. But he was constructing metaphors for the experiences that he had had himself. I think the Mongolian film was the first one, and Horse Thief was the second. Now, I think when we were talking in another disc about Red Sorghum, we noted that Wu Tianming, the head of Xi'an Film Studio, had instituted a policy of making both commercial films and art films or experimental films. He felt it was essential to the health of the studio and the prestige of the studio to do both. We have to make commercial films, he said, because that's the bread and butter of the studio. We need it as our financial lifeblood. But at the same time, we need to make experimental, innovative films because we need to push Chinese cinema forward. And it doesn't matter if they don't make so much money because they will attract a different kind of prestige to the studio. He was the only studio head in China who thought like that in the late 1980s. That's the importance of Wu Tianming. Anyway, he, in the mid-1980s, some 2 or 3 years into his tenure as the head of the studio, he convened meetings with a number of fifth-generation graduates, including Chen Kai-ge, including Tian Zhuang, and said to them, if you have projects, please bring them to Xi'an, make them here. I will give you priority. I'll give you the chance to make them. My quota each year is not so many, but I make 10, 11 films in a year, but I'm happy for half of them to be Tansuo Pian or Yishu Pian, art films. So people were, of course, impressed by this offer. The one who was never able to accept it was Wu Ziniao, who made films for other studios. He'd broken with the Shaoxiang Film Studio in Hunan, but he was then more or less drafted into the Army Film Studio, the Bai Yichang in Beijing, and ended up making a lot of films for them for 2 or 3 years. He did go to Xi'an. He did meet Wu Tianming and would have jumped at the chance to work in Xi'an, I think, but it didn't work out. For various reasons, it was not practical. But so I think of all the people that Wu Tianming approached, Tian Zhuangzhuang was the first one to come to Xi'an. And he came right after the Mongolian adventure. And he said he would like to make the same kind of film in Tibet. Not necessarily Tibet itself, maybe Qinghai, Gansu, the provinces adjacent to Tibet, also up on the high Tibetan plateau, but which are also very strongly Tibetan and Tibetan Buddhist in their culture and their history. And so he came up with Horse Thief. I think the story was his idea. He asked other people to write it for him, and he asked a couple of friends from the Film Academy to photograph it for him. Quite difficult to photograph at these high altitude places. The atmosphere is very thin, and not everybody can take it. I was there myself last year in the Qinghai Plains, and that's not as high as it gets. Although if you go up to Lake Qinghai, that's pretty high. And we found that smokers survive better than non-smokers. People whose lungs are already destroyed by smoking have an easier time of low oxygen environment than people whose lungs are very pure have a very hard time because they're gasping for breath and start to feel ill and dizzy. Anyway, just as Lu Chuan later had big nightmares with his crew shooting a Tibet film called Kekashili, or Mountain Patrol in English, so Zhuangzhuang had a lot of trouble with the crews for Horse Thief because they were filming in these very difficult high altitude conditions. And in fact, two of his classmates ended up sharing cinematography duties on this film because I don't think either of them could last the whole course of it, as it were. It was too much for one person. And Lu Chuan told me that he lost many of his crew during Kukashili. Many people had to be invalided out. They had to go back to big cities, and they had to, in some cases, stay in hospital for a while, actually, to recover from the hardship of shooting this film. So it's not unusual. Anyway, Zhuangzhuang was there much earlier, doing this ambitious film much earlier too.
告诉你们，罗尔布亵渎神灵，他抢劫官府献给寺院的礼物，官府要我严办这件事。不管怎么说，他还是我部落里的人。按照家法，不送官府，将他赶出部落，永不收留。
The film is another story about obedience to a code and breaking the code. In this case, the code is Tibetan Buddhism. And the film insists rather strongly that this character is Norbu, the central character of the film, who is the horse thief of the title. The film tells us very little about him. We know little about his background. We don't know how he came to be what he is. We don't know how he married. We don't know anything about any legitimate occupation he may have had before starting to steal people's horses. And then we also see him as a highwayman a bit later, like robbing travellers on the roads nearby. Anyway, he became a thief, basically. So he lives by crime and is progressively disowned by his own relatives. People send back gifts because they don't want it, because they think it comes from ill-gotten gains. And eventually the village throws him out after a particularly egregious crime. So he and his wife become nomads. They become wanderers. They pitch their tent on remote plains far from any community. The child becomes sick and dies. And they carry on. The wife becomes pregnant again. And the issue then becomes, can he find a way to support his wife and new child, or the wife during her pregnancy? What can he do? How difficult is it going to be for him? So that's essentially the story of the film. It's a very, very simple story of a man thrown out of his home community, takes to the road, and he has dependents to look after, and an increasingly hard time doing so. Zhuang faced a certain amount of censorship here because of sensitivities about the depiction of Tibet. In central government, people were quite worried about how Tibet was depicted in films, especially by Han Chinese directors. He was told he had to identify the period of the film. I think he wanted the film to be timeless. He wanted it to be, it could be now, it could be, a century ago, it could be a long, long time ago. We don't know. But he was told that you have to add a caption at the front, being specific about the date. So the caption that says 1923 at the beginning of the film is an added thing. It was not his idea to do that. Equally, the film begins with a sky burial scene. We see vultures gathering, basically, to consume a corpse from the sky burial ground next to a temple. Later on in the film, when a chief dies, he also is laid out for sky burial, and we see a second sky burial. I think in both cases, Zhuang had shown rather explicitly the process of the sky burial, including the literal dismemberment of the corpse to provide red meat to attract the birds. The birds have become familiar with what happens, and so they, as soon as they see activity around the burial site, the sky burial stones, they start gathering. That's the beginning of the film shows you. But anyway, this is considered a rather problematic rite, I think, by the central government in China, and they were concerned that Tibetans would feel somehow violated by having it shown very explicitly in the film. So Tian Zhuang was obliged to shorten those sky burial sequences, both of them, so you don't see anything like as much of what happens in a sky burial as you did originally. Anyhow, he decides to tell this story of a man who suffers one hardship after another, basically brought on himself by his criminal life. But he insists from the very beginning of the film that Norbu is a devout Buddhist. He goes through all the Buddhist observances. Buddhist life is a matter of making merit, basically. If you pay respect to the Buddha, you attempt to make merit in your life to guarantee a good reincarnation in your next life. That, I believe, is the main thinking. Norbu is not making merit. On quite the contrary, he's doing nothing but bad things. He is a devoted, if somewhat indulgent, father to his son. He treats his wife like furniture, basically. He has no feelings, I think, emotional or even sexual, probably, for his wife. He doesn't seem to be interested at all. He takes her completely for granted. Although when the time comes, when he decides that he's gone as far as he can, he does take steps to secure her safety, to make sure that she's going to be all right, or at least give her the best possible chance of surviving and prospering without him. So I guess you could consider that to be an act of decency on his part. But broadly speaking, nothing he does is making merit for him. Nothing is giving him a boost to his karma. Nothing is making it likelier that he will have a better life in the next life, that he will be reincarnated as a happier and more prosperous, more successful figure, because he continues to commit crimes and becomes an outcast. And he reaches the lowest point of his outcast life when he takes a job in a village which has been hit by anthrax, where a lot of the local farm stock, the sheep basically, goats, have been killed off by an epidemic of anthrax. And they attempt to exorcise anthrax from their community by constructing a death totem, a figure on a board with a skull's face. And Norbu gets a job. He's hired to carry it through the community to the river and float it, where it will be pelted with stones from the riverbank. Or at least one of the stones hits him because he's still getting away from the site. Draws blood from his head, in fact. But that's his lowest point, probably. It's the point when you become the symbolic bearer of death and evil. Where the only job you can get is taking the village's misfortune, embodied in this death totem, and carrying it to the river where it can be pelted with stones. So he suffers in all kinds of ways, but at the same time continues to profess a devotion to Buddhism. Now, this is not quite the same as the huntsman on the hunting ground, the Mongolian film, but it's analogous. It's a sense that this is a man whose life is devoted to a belief system, in this case Buddhism, but at the same time it's a life spent transgressing. It's a life spent breaking the rules, breaking social rules, breaking moral rules, breaking legal rules, and breaking community traditions. So forcing himself basically into a kind of exile because the community doesn't want him anymore. They want rid of him, in fact, they want him to go. We later hear that his one confederate in crime, partner in crime, has died with all his family. He stayed in the village, apparently, or in the community. We don't exactly hear how he died, but anyway, he's gone completely. So Norobu's survival, which is very precarious, as we see in the film, lucky in a way, but inconclusive. We hear that Norobu's partner in crime, a man called Naore, we see them together at the start, robbing horses, in fact stealing horses. It's the first glimpse we have of both of them. It's at night, so you don't see either of them very clearly as it happens. But Naore, we hear later in the film, has died together with his whole family. So he apparently stayed in the community and has paid some terrible price for it somehow.
闹热呢？
闹热一觉都死了。
Norobu was exiled, was sent off, told never show your face in this community again or we'll cut your hands off as a thief. And so he becomes a nomadic exile with his wife and child. The child dies, in fact, not too soon afterwards. Anyhow, he suffers all kinds of things, including the anthrax episode that we've just discussed, and all of this takes place within the context of a cycle, an annual cycle of Buddhist ceremonies. And throughout the film, at regular intervals, we see Norobu present at Buddhist ceremonies, large-scale ritual ceremonies, the dedication of sacred rams to the mountain god. Famously, a masked dance performance, which takes up quite a lot of time in the film, where children dance with skull masks, and then adults dance with animal face masks. And this is basically documentary. This is ethnographic documentary by Tianzhuangzhuang. He used the real ceremony and integrated his actors into the scene. But the key thing is that Norobu and his wife feel the need to pay respect to these Buddhist ceremonies. After the death of their child, they become nomadic on foot. We see that there's a long montage sequence of them traveling and prostrating themselves on the ground as they go in a very traditional Buddhist gesture of respect. And it's a complicated montage because you see the two of them on the road, walking on the road, every few steps prostrating themselves on the ground and then getting up and continuing a few more steps. But it's mixed through the montage with 2 or sometimes even 3 layers of superimposition. And the superimpositions show ornate temples, buildings, palaces in Tibet, in Tibetan cities. I think for Tien Zhuangzhuang, there's a kind of dreamy fascination with what you might call the spiritual aspects of Buddhism. He wants to communicate to the viewer the spiritual appeal that these ideas and these traditions and these images, these visual stimuli have for believers. And at the same time, he's putting that into the context of a story about a man who is a chronic criminal, somebody who breaks the rules at every turn. His whole life, as far as we know, whole life in the film anyway, we don't know about before the film's story started. We don't know where he came from, what his background was. But certainly all the time we are with him in the film, he breaks the rules, he breaks the laws, he breaks everything. He commits violence, he suffers some violence, and he is on a downward spiral in a way which reaches its nadir, its lowest point, when he carries the death totem for the village hit by anthrax. Here again, I think, is a metaphor. It's Zhuangzhuang is very interested in the culture. He's probably aware, in fact, certainly he's aware of earlier films about Tibet or set in Tibet, made by Han Chinese directors. This is before the time of Pema Tseiden and a new generation of ethnic Tibetan directors making Tibetan films in Tibet, which there are now a proliferating number. It's a growing industry. There's more and more people, although Pema Tseiden or Wanma Caidan, as he's called in his Chinese form of his name, is a key figure, I think, partly because he's also a prolific novelist and writer, but also because he has made it his business to inspire and train a younger generation. So many of the people who've worked with him have gone on to make films in their own right. It's continuing now. You know, one of the assistants on Tarlo, his last film, has just directed his first film, supervised by Pema. So there's a burgeoning Tibetan film industry, which is cloistered in a fairly small number of Tibetans who are creative and active individuals. But back in the day of 1986, which is when Tien Zhuangzhuang made Horse Thief, that didn't exist yet. There was no such cultural movement in Tibet. Nobody in Tibet was directing, no Tibetan was directing films at that time. Other Han Chinese like Zhuangzhuang had done so, but the film that Zhuangzhuang made is very different, I think, from earlier films. Number one, it doesn't have any Han Chinese in it. The cast is entirely Tibetan. I imagine that this disc is going to be showing the Putonghua version of the film, but there was originally also a version in Tibetan, recorded in the Gansu dubbing studios. There was a foreign expert, as they were called at the time, in China Film Corporation, who said we should be releasing the Tibetan version. It's a Tibetan story, the actors are all Tibetan, we should be showing the Tibetan version. So initially, if any company which in the world, any distributor in the world who bought the film soon after it was made would get the Tibetan version. That I think, to be honest, I've seen both, and I think the Putonghua version, since there are no long conversation scenes in the film, since nobody is really seen in close-up speaking, it doesn't matter terribly much about things like synchronization. But since the film was shot without sound and was post-synced in both versions, I think you'd have to say that the Putonghua version is more professionally dubbed than the Tibetan version was. It just looks and sounds better. I mean, it just seems like more convincing sound, to me anyway. It felt like that. But it's somehow regrettable because the film is very true to a certain Tibetan experience. And Zhuangzhuang kind of, in a way, erased himself. I mean, he stood back from it, and he was very respectful of Tibetan culture, Tibetan traditions, Tibetan behaviors, Tibetan communities, all those things. He went out of his way to be respectful, just as he had been with Mongolians in the previous film. And in that sense, it makes perfect sense for it to be in Tibetan too, because I'm sure that the actors spoke Tibetan during the shooting of the film. And it would be quite nice to preserve it in that form. Anyway, it does exist in that form. It was at the time shown in a Tibetan version, and probably actually had more screenings in the Tibet region than it did anywhere else in China, because this famously was one of Xi'an Film Studio's least successful films. Famously, I think only 4 copies were sold for distribution throughout China. So although the film went on to acquire some kind of, I think in the West we'd call it a cult reputation. I think people came to know of this film, and it's now a very respected film and a very much liked film. It's seen as a very modernist film in many ways, and certainly a very daring break with earlier depictions of Tibet and other ethnic minority regions of China. At the time, it was highly controversial and very, very unpopular. So it was a film notably unsuccessful. So Wu Tianming really had to, pay the price for making this film. He was pilloried by many people. He was ridiculed, particularly by Wu Yigong, the head of the Shanghai Film Studio, who said, making films that nobody can understand, nobody wants to see, it's ridiculous, why are you wasting state money on projects like this? And Wu Tianming had to give his answer, which is, we should be making Tanzuopian as well. The fact that this doesn't have a mass popular appeal right now doesn't mean we shouldn't be making it. That's also an important part of what we do. On this occasion, that Zhuang was criticised by some journalist and said something like, how can you make a film that nobody wants to see? And Zhuang's answer famously was, well, I make films for the coming century. I want my films to still be watched in the 21st century. And, his dream has come true, but hence this very Blu-ray that we're busy working on as we speak. He was exactly right. The film's time came. And now I think it will have a much, much larger audience than it was allowed to have in 1986 in China. But, the answer from the Film Association was, well, if you're making films for the next century, maybe you'd like to collect your pay in the next century. And, there's no answer to that. It's a very strong put down in a way, except that the amounts of money we're talking about are very, very modest, very small, because the fixed salary of a film director in China at that time was very, very low. So it's not like Tian Zhuang was getting rich from making these films. He was barely subsisting, in fact. And I think he needed income from other sources. In fact, like many filmmakers, it was not possible to live just on your salary as a filmmaker. It was very hard, especially since people expect you to treat them to dinners and such like because you're the director. And if you're going to fulfill that kind of social obligation or professional obligation to your crew and your actors, you need other sources of income to do it, or certainly you did then. Anyway, Tian Zhuang, I think, coped, but after making this film, he didn't continue in Xi'an Film Studio. It was not possible for him to make another film for Wu Tianming right afterwards, after the controversies surrounding Horse Thief. So he was suddenly Beijing Film Studio, to which he'd been assigned in the first place, decided that they did have work for him after all. So he returned from Xi'an to Beijing, to his home in Beijing, and was assigned a literary adaptation. He was asked to make an adaptation of a Lao Shi story called Gushu Yi Ren. It's a fairly conventional historical drama. It doesn't have anything of the idiosyncrasy or originality of a film like Horse Thief. But it's a solid piece of work, it's a decent piece of work, and it expresses something that was, I think, also quite close to Zhuang's heart, which was the independence of artists. He always felt that artists should be independent, should not be answerable to higher authorities or rules and things like that. They should be free to create their work as best they can. And for him, the Lao Shi story expressed that in a certain sense. So he was very happy to make it in that way. But the film he made is a very much more conventional film than Horse Thief was.